I think it would be a gross understatement to say that Final Fantasy XV was only in development for a long time. But now that the game has finally seen the light of day, I thought it would be interesting to go back and take a look at the game throughout those years, with a very brief history, followed by a comparison between the 2015 demo and the final game. So let's get started. The game was announced all the way back at E3 2006, exclusively for PlayStation 3. It was known as Final Fantasy Versus 13 at the time and was pretty much unrelated to Final Fantasy 13 itself. With Tetsuya Nomura acting as the director, it was thought to be more of an action-oriented RPG in the vein of Kingdom Hearts, but of course, there wasn't a lot to draw on at this point. There are some ideas here that ultimately persisted right up until the end, but this is just a CGI trailer. The way Noctis warps up onto the building here, for instance, is reminiscent of a similar mechanic in the final game, and some of the scenery isn't too far removed either. There was another CG trailer then that showed up a couple of years later, showcasing additional characters and elements, but by this point the game was being worked on by only a rather bare-bones team. There just wasn't much to show yet. And besides, most of the focus was on Final Fantasy XIII itself, not this spin-off. 2008 was also the year in which the Crystal tools were demonstrated at GDC. It was here that the original White engine powering Final Fantasy Versus 13 and Final Fantasy 13 itself was renamed and shown as the Crystal tools. Starting in 2005, Square Enix sought to build its own in-house technology, which resulted in the creation of a technology division. Without dedicated team members, however, progress was slow, and in 2006, the Research and Development Division was established instead, with the goal of creating tools that could be used across all games within the studio. Of course, this didn't exactly go as well as they had planned, but things eventually did come together well enough to produce Final Fantasy XIII itself, years after it was announced. But at this point, from the public's perspective at least, Versus 13 was nothing more than a bunch of CGI mock-ups. That is until 2010, when a trailer showcasing how the game might look and play was finally revealed. Here we start to get an idea of where the game was going, complete with elements that would actually persist in the final product, including this gas station here, and the rather largish looking world. Over the next year or so, we started to get more glimpses of what was being attempted here, and elements of it very much resemble the final product. Just before all of this though, it became clear that the Crystal tools designed for 13 weren't really a good fit for the more open-ended design of Versus 13, and thus began the development of Luminous Studio, the engine and toolset that would ultimately power the final game. Of course, during this period, the game was kind of being developed with a mix of technologies, and it's not entirely clear how well things were really going to turn out in the end. I'm sure the situation inside the studio at this time was incredibly stressful. At least the game was finally into real production, since really the prior 4 years or so following its announcement involved very few production people. But just as things were starting to change, the game console manufacturers were starting to discuss the next generation of consoles. With the way development was going then, it only made sense to target these new machines instead of sticking with older platforms, and as such, Square Enix renamed the game to Final Fantasy XV in 2012, to be officially revealed in 2013 under the new name. From this point then, various trailers and information continue to stream out in bits, and it does much more closely resemble the end product. During this period, Tetsuya Nomura stepped away from the project and Hajime Tabata took the lead instead, so the Final Fantasy XV we have today was really kind of only in proper development for roughly 4 years or so, it would seem. Of course, that's just a very, very brief summary of these complicated events, but as you can see, the game we receive still shares some of those elements. Of course, even after being re-revealed in 2013, things were still changing in order to finish the game. This E3 2013 trailer, for instance, is filled with content and scenarios that are completely absent from the final game. The first real opportunity in which players were able to sample the game came in early 2015 with the release of Final Fantasy Type 0 HD. This demo was entitled Episode du Sky, and it was designed to give users a chance to preview the game while also providing its developers valuable feedback. For the time, the development team was actively listening to fans in an attempt to meet expectations, and this demo would even be updated once with a huge chunk of improvements over time. I thought it would be fun to go back and draw real comparisons between this pre-release demo here and the final game. It's interesting to look back on the changes made since the demo too. The lighting system, for instance, has been modified and changed since then and produces more realistic results in the final product versus the demo. This is something you'll notice throughout the comparison and is clearly the result of an artistic change. The original demo has a much hazier appearance throughout, as you can see. I do think it looks good in both cases though, but in the end, I do prefer the more realistic results in the final game. This also has an impact on the materials, both natural and man-made throughout, which also appear more realistic in the final game. Then we have the changes made to the way the LOD system works, where we now see less noticeable pop-in throughout the game. It's still there, mind you, but well, you can see for yourselves. That said, the shadow draw-in is still pretty evident here and can be a distraction. We also see loads of changes made to the objects scattered and placed across the terrain. Trees that weren't there before are added in, plants are moved around and changed, and the overall scene just looks pretty different in terms of the type of environment it's portraying due to the variation in the flora and fauna. And of course the aforementioned lighting. And then we jump over here where we can see how the game compares in its more forested areas as well. I do think it looks pretty similar here in terms of construction, but the trees do appear thicker in the final game, and the change in lighting remains rather evident. Jumping ahead then, let's leave the forest and check out the Chocobo rental place in the game. It certainly looks similar, at least on the surface, but there are a lot of changes and tweaks made to this area as you can see, and it does feel more complete in its final form, I think. Which then brings us up to this cliffside for a nice rotating view of the land. What do you guys think? Then we have this still shot here, which shows off better texture filtering here in the demo versus the final game on PS4 for some reason. But hey, at least there's a new tree there. Then we have the water. There is also a rather noticeable difference here. Which do you guys prefer? But the main improvement actually comes from performance. The demo side here is running on PS4, and it showcases plenty of hitches and skips in addition to frame pacing issues on top of the normal slowdown. It was pretty abysmal at times, and was also only 900p and featured poor anti-aliasing, resulting in bad image quality. In order to line up the shots though, I used the PS4 Pro in light mode here, and we can see that the frame rate is of course steady and devoid of frame pacing issues, but as we highlighted before, the stock PS4 in high mode and the Pro do suffer from this issue. It is interesting to see how this problem has existed since the 2015 demo. It was just somewhat concealed by the more serious performance dips. Overall though, I think we're looking at a pretty nice improvement here all around. There were a lot of changes made to the game, both major and minor, since this demo, and performance has also improved dramatically. Yes, the frame pacing issue remains, and that's disappointing for sure, but the optimization effort is awesome nonetheless. And even greater strides were made on Xbox One, where the demo ran very slowly, but the final game is quite smooth. Unfortunately, you can't re-download this demo on Xbox once you remove it from your system, so I couldn't actually compare it this time, but hey, you still get the idea. But that's all for now though. I hope you enjoyed this quick look back on the game over the years. It's great to see that everything worked out in the end, and we ended up with a solid game. With such a troubled development, that's certainly a nice surprise. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.